1991, Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 9A.
To begin, I want to welcome everybody to this presentation, Ethnic Mismatches, and thank you for coming. This has been a very, very interesting topic for me to pull together, and I'm sure for our panelists as well. The way we'll be dividing the material up is that I will be presenting a review of some of the literature that's available. This is a very diffuse topic, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, and we're looking forward to the communication after the panelists each have an opportunity to present his and her own material. So we're looking forward to a very vibrant discussion this afternoon and look forward to your participation in it. After spending literally months in preparation for this workshop and doing what seems to be enough research to earn a PhD, I have to be frank and for me to first present a framework for our discussion by reviewing some of the available literature, and then to have each of our three panelists share his, her experiences and reflections. And I want to thank the panelists for volunteering to do this because it is such a difficult topic that I think each of them has had to do a lot of thinking in terms of what might be of interest and how to present. And I'm looking forward to what they have to share with us also. After that, we will be able to spend the remainder of our time in dialogue. Just looking at the Webster's Unabridged Dictionary definition of human nature will give you a glimmering of what I was referring to when I suggested that we are dealing with less than precise meanings. Human nature, A, the complex of behavioral patterns, attitudes, and ideas which man has acquired socially, called also cultural nature. Socially conditioned human nature, the qualities of the personality that make it like other personalities within the society. B, the complex of fundamental dispositions and traits of man, sometimes considered innate. In that definition alone, we have the balancing beam of what is often called the nature-nurture controversy, but perhaps more accurately is the duality of human nature and who we are. On the one hand, as in the first definition, we are who we have been taught and have learned to be. On the other hand, as in the second definition, we have underlying aspects or inclinations that may be part of us from birth. This part of our presentation is a prelude to looking more specifically at the subject of ethnic mismatches, at how, or in some people's minds, whether our ethnicity affects our identity and personality. It will give us an opportunity to consider together certain concepts and definitions, providing some common ground for pursuing our inquiry. Interestingly, the subject of human nature is once again being investigated. After I had agreed to do this workshop and began to do my research, I was surprised to find how little recent information there was in many of the areas I thought to look into, and that it seemed as though, having moved from the concept of the melting pot to the concept of pluralism, investigations and publications were focusing on multiculturalism. Perhaps most familiar to some of you would be the focus on ethnic studies in colleges and universities, and the phrase ethnic sensitive as applied in such areas as elementary school education, the workplace, social work practice, and the like. While this is well and good in some dimensions and problematic in others, it left a giant gap on the continuum of understanding the individual and how we got to be who we are. Then just last month, on the front page of the March 17th New York Times Book Review was an in-depth review of a book entitled In Search of Human Nature by Carl N. Degler, who teaches history at Stanford University. In an accompanying box titled Biology Could Not Be Omitted, Mr. Degler said that when he began working on this book, he expected to find overwhelming evidence that those who believed human behavior was genetically determined were driven more by dogma than by a dispassionate interest in scientific truth. But he was surprised to find that those who rejected biological for social explanations were just as ideological, and that there are no radical new answers to explain human behavior. Nevertheless, what his book apparently looks at is material at the heart of our dialogue this afternoon: social biology, race, culture, ethnicity. If his book is any harbinger of things to come, and apparently the reviewer, who is a professor of human development at the University of Chicago and the president of an organization called the Society for Psychological Anthropology, thinks it is, we will begin to see more material on the subject. Those of us who are here today and interested in how this affects people in adoption may be at the beginning of some exciting new awarenesses in the field. Now, let us turn our attention to some of the concepts and definitions I referred to earlier when I spoke of providing something of a common ground for our inquiry. The way I have divided this is into three very broad areas: ethnicity, adoption, and identity. What I will be presenting makes no pretense at being any more authoritative than an educated review and amalgamation of existing literature, though it might point us in the direction of new research directions. What do we mean when we speak of ethnicity, or of ethnic, or of being a member of an ethnic group? The term seems to be used in several different ways, oftentimes synonymous with race and culture. So it isn't surprising that we almost immediately run into complexities and confusions and conundrums. For some of the material in this section, I want to acknowledge and refer you to the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, an impressive compendium of material on over 100 groups, along with thematic essays, maps, and graphs. The word ethnicity is of recent usage, but the idea is old. The less precise definitions in the early social science literature convey the same interpretation as that used by the popular media. Groups of distinctive national origin or language viewed as foreign minorities, such as the Irish, the Hungarians, or the Italians. Ethnicity was not an attribute of the native-born Protestant Yankees or of the dominant majority group in the community. Ethnicity, furthermore, did not have a racial, meaning physical, component. So Afro-Americans and American Indians were not considered to be ethnic groups. Here one must deal with the confusions in the past usage of the word race, which was often used to mean ethnicity, as in the Irish race or the Jewish race. Ethnicity did not generally apply to religious distinctiveness either. So the Mormons and the Amish were not typically seen as ethnic groups, although the Jews were variously described as racial, ethnic, or religious, depending often on the context. While the words ethnic and ethnicity were not generally used before the turn of the century, the idea was conveyed implicitly and in a general way through the use of such terms as immigrant group, ethnic stock, language group, race, and national background. The vagaries of ethnic classification are especially apparent in the several United Nations comparisons of the criteria used in the World Census, According to the first of these comparisons in 1957, 39 countries divided their populations by a geographical ethnic criterion, 10 by race, 8 by culture, 22 by a combination of race and culture, 11 by a combination of culture and geography, 1 or 2 by origin, as indicated by the language of the respondent's father, and several by mode of life. Even when the same term was used, the meaning was sometimes different, and the enumerations have not improved since the initial comparison. As you can hear from this material, a precise definition of ethnicity eludes us, though we certainly have a wealth of concepts to consider. Turning again to Webster's Unabridged Dictionary, we find the current definition to contain old as well as more recent meanings. 1, of or relating to the Gentiles or to nations not converted to Christianity. In this definition, Gentile is capitalized and means heathen or pagan. 2, relating to a community of physical and mental traits possessed by those members of a group as a product of their common heredity and cultural tradition. An aspect of all of this that I find particularly interesting to think about in relation to our topic of ethnic mismatches is what is referred to as nodal points for cross-cultural comparison. 8 were singled out that could illustrate a wide spectrum of other attitudes and behaviors. Attitudes toward the divine, the holy, and the sacred. Attitudes toward nature, history, and moral striving. Attitudes toward intelligence, learning, and ideas. Attitudes toward the rein to be given passion and emotion, and in which respects. Attitudes toward authority, the past, tradition. Attitudes toward individuality or the commonality of human living, toward solitude and solidarity, self and family. Attitudes towards masculinity and fathering, towards femininity and mothering. Attitudes toward the power of goodness and the power of evil in human affairs. If each of us takes a moment to reflect upon our own deepest associations with each of these, we cannot help encountering our fundamental beliefs which derive from previous generations. To be sure, many of us believe that we are free to turn in new directions, to erase or cover over the tracings of the past. We are not imprisoned by our social and cultural inheritance, but we have in fact felt its imprint and have been given at least nascent definition by it. This material, which is from the essay on pluralism, a political perspective in the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, is referring to our experienced past, not our genetic inheritance. Most of the writings on ethnic behaviors begin and end with the premise that ethnicity is something chosen or ascribed, and that each group's behavioral characteristics are taught or learned. Therefore, that essay goes on to acknowledge that while each of us as individuals is responsible for recreating ourselves or for creating our own identity, each of us is a social creature, in part shaped by the others of whom we are a part. Our destiny is familial as well as individual. Let me add now another piece of information for you to consider. It comes from a 1975 publication entitled Ethnic Identity and is a piece by George Devereaux on ethnic identity, its logical foundations, and its dysfunctions. And this is a quote: "A distinction must also be made between the actualization and the exhibition of ethnic personality in behavior. Much ethnic personality-determined behavior is actualized, manifested, unwittingly, and at times without an awareness that the behavior manifests the ethnic personality. Roughly speaking, such behavior is actualized because owing to conditioning, it follows the line of least resistance and involves the smallest effort, at least for the one who performs it, unquote. An example of this is although displaying machismo is easy for a Cuban, a Hopi may view it as a singularly strenuous behavior. In that piece, and the one immediately before it, we have emphasis on behavior coming as a result of exposure, of social learning. What of the behaviors that seem out of keeping with one's background and experience, however? Take, for example, the following excerpt from Michael Doris's exquisitely written novel, A Yellow Raft in Blue Water. The two characters speaking are an American Indian woman and an Anglo priest. He has just said something to her in her native language. One reason I wanted to learn, Father Hurlburt said, is that, well, you know, I'm part Indian myself. I turned to scrutinize him. I could see it. I don't know much about that branch of my family. My father's mother from New York State was a Seneca, but I only vaguely remember her. I've heard of them, I said, but I didn't know what. That's how I got interested in Indians, I guess. It must be in my blood. Father Hurlburt laughed at his own joke, and when I failed to join in, he didn't speak again for 40 miles. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander. I couldn't quite think of him as Indian, but knowing that about his grandmother changed something. It made me less surprised about the night when he came to our house and listened to Clara's plan, when I noticed him as more than a priest. Now I had an explanation. One of the few pieces of material that I found which actually addresses biological differences in temperament and behavior among ethnic groups is an article entitled Ethnic Differences in Babies by Daniel G. Friedman, which appeared in the January 1979 edition of the magazine Human Nature. In it, he states, "My position on this issue is simple. We are totally biological, totally environmental. The two are as inseparable as is an object and its shadow. Or as psychologist Donald O. Hebb has expressed it, we are 100% innate, 100% acquired. One might add to Hebb's formulation, 100% biological, 100% cultural. As D.T. Suzuki, the Sen scholar, once told an audience of neuropsychiatrists, you took heredity and environment apart, and now you are stuck with the problem of putting them together again." At the conclusion of his article, Mr. Friedman, then a professor of behavioral sciences at the University of Chicago, stated that he believed his data warranted that we should drop two long-cherished myths. One, no matter what our ethnic background, we are all born alike. Two, culture and biology are separate entities. He went on, clearly we are biosocial creatures in everything we do and say, and it is time that anthropologists, psychologists, and population geneticists start speaking the same language. In light of what we know, only a truly holistic, multidisciplinary approach makes sense. Without elaborating on or belaboring the point, let us add in, for awareness at least, that some of what makes this a difficult subject are the strong feelings and attitudes people have. The positive side of ethnic pride and specialness is counterbalanced by prejudice, discrimination, and a history of local and world wars. No doubt this affects research inclinations to some degree, as do the many variables to be considered. On that note, let us segue into our second broad area and the primary reason we are at this conference, adoption, where there are equally vague concepts, variables, and fears of many sorts. For a comprehensive treatment of biological aspects, I suggest you might want to look at Remy J. Cataret's chapter, Biological Perspectives of Adoptee Adjustment in the 1990 publication, The Psychology of Adoption, edited by David Brodzinski and Marshall Schechter. Discussed is the genetic dimension of human behavior, particularly that which brings adopted children and adolescents to agencies and clinics due to psychological problems. The article reviews many of the studies conducted over the past 25 years and briefly discusses temperament and personality, the one area in which there appears to be agreement about the existence of a genetic or constitutional origin. When we speak of temperament, we are referring to such dimensions as emotionality, activity, and sociability. The Colorado Adoption Project is a longitudinal study that is investigating these types of issues. Among the preliminary published findings in 1985 were that in the first 2 years of the adoptee's life, the adoptive parent's personality has little power to predict temperament, and that there was some evidence that the genotype of the child might react to environmental factors in the home, indicating that adoptive parents are likely responding or reacting to the genetic makeup of the child. With regard to personality manifestations later in life, adoptee studies indicate modest positive correlations between biological parents and adopted children, but almost no correlation between adoptive parents and their adoptee. The major finding in most studies is that shared environment contributes very little to adult personality characteristics. However, genetic effects, while demonstrable, do not appear to be all-controlling, and other factors such as unique experiences or gene-environment interaction might figure significantly in personality development. All of this material, that is, about genetics, personality, and temperament, is in what is still an early state of knowledge, but may ultimately lead to some practical considerations in adoptive placement. For example, if it could be shown that children from extroverted biological parents did poorly when placed with introverted adoptive parents, personality genetics would be an important consideration in adoptive placement. Recently, at a conference on women in a workshop called The Girl Within, I picked up my adoption ears when I heard one of the participants during her turn in describing something about one's childhood say, "I never felt Swedish." At the break, I asked her about the remark, explaining about this workshop I was preparing and wondering whether she had been adopted. She readily confirmed that she had been, and that when she learned her birth father was Ukrainian, she felt for the first time that she had an identity that fit. It explained to her her size, tall though not large boned, with good sized hands and feet, and her preference for bright colors. Her father was a seaman and spoke 7 languages. Although she does not find she has a particular ear for languages, she does know French well enough to enjoy reading novels in the language. Probably one of the more germane articles on this subject is Trans-Ethnic Adoption and Personality Traits, a lesson from Japanese orphans returning from China to Japan, in the American Journal of Psychiatry, March 1990. This study, which is part of a larger research project, concerns 25 Japanese who were left as orphans in Japan at the end of World War II. Even though raised as Chinese culturally for almost their entire lives, most had retained certain Japanese personality traits and social behavior from early childhood. And these characteristics distinguished them from their Chinese counterparts. Of the 25 interviewed, 12%, were separated from their parents before the age of 1 year. 20%, between the ages of 1 and 2. 52%, between 3 and 5 years of age, and 16% were between the ages of 6 and 8. Among the 9 who were under the age of 3 when separation took place, all except 1 had no recollection of separation. Also significant is that this was a period in which there were strong pressures against the Japanese as an enemy nation, and the Chinese culture emphasized blood relationships, holding others, especially those who adopted Japanese orphans, in strong disfavor. The most salient findings of this study are: 1, that temperament may be related to hereditary predisposition, as suggested earlier, and 2, that other aspects, such as behavior relating to interpersonal relationships and food tastes, are formed at early and later stages of childhood. Therefore, it would appear that one of the variables to be considered in future investigations of this subject is the age at the time of adoptive placement and influences of the earliest environment or environments. With that said, let us turn briefly to our third and last major consideration: identity. Much has been written about identity, both pertaining to and separate from adoption. Erickson's material in developmental literature underlies scores of modern investigations by social scientists, writers, and others. If we look at the history of ideas, however, we see threaded throughout the philosophical questions of who am I, to what do I belong in the world, of what am I a part. When it comes to adoption, we have additional subjective complexities, which are variously thought of as a dichotomy between the real self and the false self, or dual identities, or cognitive dissonance. These are different concepts than bonding and attachment, and can help to open our thinking to the multiple facets that make up identity. In a book titled Invisible Loyalties, the author comments, even in cases of earliest adoption, the existential significance of the natural parents usually keeps the minds of adopted children occupied for a lifetime. When it comes to issues of group identity and identification, would this not also be true in some dimension? We may not know for years to come the answers to some of the questions raised in this workshop, whether there are ethnic aspects of identity that are inherited rather than learned, and what the impact of this might be for those concerned with adoption. We can, however, encourage a spirit of openness to inquiry and extend to all the right to know what there is to know. Before proceeding to our panelists, I want to end this segment with some words by Adrienne Rich in her introduction to Irene Klepfitz's book of poems, A Few Words in the Mother Tongue. To inherit an uninterrupted and recognized culture is a privilege. At very least, it shows you what you have to struggle with as person and as artist. Like a strong parent who both teaches and browbeats, can be learned from, stormed away from, forgiven, but whose influence can never be denied. Like a family from which, even in separation, you bring away certain gestures, tones, ways of looking, something taken for granted, perhaps felt as constriction, nonetheless a source, a point of departure. And with that, I would like to turn our presentation over to our panelists. On my immediate left is Mel Howell, who will be speaking first, and then Joan Charlin, and then Stephen Whitney. So, yes, thank you for reminding me.
My name is Mel Howell, and I'm 41. I'm married, and I have 4 children, 3 boys and a daughter. And I'm a pastor at the Evangelical Free Church here in Fullerton. I was adopted at birth, and I was adopted into a family where there were no other children. My adoptive parents had had a child who died just hours after she was born, and as a result of complications of that birth, my mother was unable to have other children, and so by the time I came into their family, they were ecstatic at the opportunity to raise a child. I was the only child in the family, and I always wished that I had brothers and sisters, but I had wonderful parents and never had any sense of missing anything by having my mother or my father to raise me. I remember that from my earliest days, my parents let me know that I was adopted, but the way they conveyed that led me to believe that only the most special people in the world were adopted, and it was really a shame if you didn't have that privilege. And so I never had a sense of missing anything or wondering really that I can recall as a young child about my birth parents. However, I did express, I suppose, on a regular basis to my parents a desire to have brothers and sisters, so that was perhaps the only void I could think of. It wasn't until I was actually in high school or in college and I was taking a class in genetics that I began to wonder in greater detail about my birth parents. And I realized that while my friends could explain many things about their physical characteristics and perhaps their personality characteristics as well, I did not have that portion of information about my background. My wife always wanted me to find out if I could learn any more about my birth family, but it was not of particular interest to me until my father died when I was 29. And at the time of his funeral, a man came up to me and told me that he had had a part in helping to arrange my adoption and kind of opened some doors for me, although I never quite figured out his real connection to that. That made me wonder more about that part of my heritage. My mother had died when I was 16. And so for the first time in my life, I really did have a sense of rootlessness. My grandparents were both gone. My aunts and uncles were rather distant, and so I really did not have a feeling of a connection to a family like I had had before. It wasn't, however, until I was about, I suppose, 37, that a friend came to me and told me that he had started working for an organization that helped adoptive family members connect. And he tried to convince me to work through his organization to find my missing family. I told him I had no interest in doing so, but how much did it cost? And when he told me that it would cost $1,250, I definitely was not interested. But the next week he came to me with a little cassette tape which gave some information about how you could on your own search for your missing adoptive or birth parents. To be honest, I really had no great interest in listening to the tape, but found myself later that day in the car with the cassette recorder and the tape lying there, and so I plopped it in and became so enamored by the stories that I heard of these wonderful reunions that took place that I thought to myself, this might be a fun adventure. Not so much that I would ever find my birth parents. I really didn't expect that would be the case. But that perhaps the process itself would be an adventure for my children and for my wife and I to do together. And so with that in mind, we immediately threw ourselves into this with great gusto. The first night I called my aunt, my mother's sister, and I told her what I was doing and asked her how, as one of my closest family members, she would feel about this. And she said that that would be fine, but just to always remember that they were really my family. And I told her that was not at all an issue in this situation. That would never change. And then she told me two things that really served as a catalyst to me in the search. I asked her if she knew anything at all about my birth parents, and she said she really only knew two things. One was that I had a lot of brothers and sisters. She wasn't sure how many, but she thought perhaps 7 or 8. Well, that immediately served as a motivation for me. I hadn't really even given much consideration to siblings. It was always more the birth parent dimension. And the other thing that she mentioned was that both my birth mother and father were Jewish. And that while my family did not see that as a real issue, they thought it was unusual that a Jewish family would allow a Gentile family to adopt their baby. And as a minister, I found that to be a fascinating thing, too. Now, it wasn't until 10 months later that I found my family through a long process that I won't go into now. But when I made the first connection, it was with a brother. And I actually, in the whole process, when I made the first call to him, I was on my way on a trip to Israel. And I was standing at the LA airport because of the timing. This all happened on a weekend just before I was leaving. And I called and explained to him what I was doing and asked him if he had ever heard about the possibility that there might be another child born in their family. And I asked if his parents had ever told him that, and he said no, that he hadn't. And I told him I was on my way to Israel and so forth. Well, it was a week later when I returned from Israel, and I made the contact back with him again to see if he had found out any more about this, because he said he was going to contact his sisters during that interval and see if they knew anything about this. It discovered that he did know something about another sibling, but only because he had come across it in some birth records that he had uncovered in his mother's documents. But that his sisters were quite upset with him because he had not found out whether I was married, whether I had children, and what I did for a living. And frankly, I was hoping the what I did for a living could be delayed a little bit longer because I wasn't sure how they would perceive this with their Jewish background. So another week passed by, and I found myself with my wife sitting in a car waiting to knock on a door to meet 3 sisters at that time and 1 brother and some brothers-in-law. When my sister, who is here with me today, sitting here on the front row, opened the door, of course we both looked at each other up and down to see about these physical characteristics that Carol related to. And then I reached out my hand to shake hers, but she did something that I will never forget, and that is that she reached out to hug me and bring me into that kind of a warm welcome. Behind her was another sister and another brother, and each one of them hugged me as I walked through the door, and that was really the entrance into a whole different phase of my life and my family's life. It's been about almost 3 years since we had this initial reunion. We do have 5 sisters, and then counting me, 3 brothers who were born into this family. The 7 older children were all raised together by their parents. I was adopted at birth because at that time both of the parents were older. They were having financial difficulties. They were living in a very small apartment, and I guess felt they just could not handle 1 more child with an age span of 25 years all the way down to me at birth. We have had a lot of fun together. My oldest sister and my oldest brother are dead. I never had the opportunity to meet them. My birth father died about a year after I was born, and my birth mother is still living. She is in her mid-80s. Her health is not very good, and after a lot of painstaking discussion, the family decided that it would be better for her not to know who I was. She had, at the day that I was born, told a sister who was engaged in the process of adoption never to mention this ever again, and those children pretty well kept to that promise. And so she does not know who I am, although she has spent time with me on a number of family occasions and thinks that I'm a friend of her daughters and other members of her family. And so I have been able to be included in that sense in the family when she is there, but not at an identification level. In light of this particular topic, we've given a lot of thought, and it's very difficult to try to discern which part of you and your identity and your personality derives from parents you never really knew, which part of you derives from your adoptive parents who raised you from birth and invested everything they had, and which part of you is, just a collection of your culture. There are a lot of similarities that we have been able to discern, although when you have 8 children, they're bound to be a wide continuum. So, you can find, I think, almost anything you want to make you feel either connected or disconnected. There are some obvious similarities. I look like some of the members of the family and much less like others, and that's true for all the other children as well. Sharon and I were talking as we were coming that her husband identifies certain physical characteristics about me that is very similar to her, and so does my wife, and other members of her family do too. We have certain common facial expressions, certain mannerisms that identify you with a sibling that we obviously didn't learn by being together. So whether we're seeing them because we want to see them or whether they're really there is hard to determine, but there seem to be those kinds of commonalities. I was interested when you mentioned food, because that's one of the first things that we began to talk about, and discovered that we like a lot of similar kinds of foods and unusual foods and ethnic kinds of foods. Not so much Jewish, but other kinds of ethnic types of foods. And so that has been an easy blending. We all share within the family, really all the way down, an interest in family. We all have a strong value in that way. And we all are very much involved with our children's lives. We're committed to marriages in our family generally, and that's proven true. We have an interest in education. For many years, I worked primarily with young children in a ministry in a church. My sister is a preschool teacher. Another one of my sisters is a teacher's aide here in Anaheim, and another teacher was a preschool teacher up in Anchorage, Alaska. So there's that commonality, which seems a little unusual for that many siblings.
This is the end of side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B. Adoption Congress, 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991, Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 9B.
You know, it's like, you know, don't bother us. And I'm wondering, is that how most Jews are?
I've had people say things, you know, let's all stand up and say no. You know, I was raised my whole life having people say to me, you don't look Jewish and you don't act Jewish. I thought, what the hell am I supposed to have, horns and a tail? You know, it's real interesting. We grow up with a lot of anti-Semitism. And as I was telling these two people at lunch today who I've never met in my life, my 12-year-old was called a Jewish pig walking home from school a couple of weeks ago. And my background biologically probably is not Jewish, from Memphis, Tennessee in 1946. Probably not. Probably the backseat of a 39 Pontiac. But, you know, that was something that I feel very comfortable with. And I'm sorry that you're having a difficult time searching. But if you call a synagogue or you call someplace and try and find out information like that, people there don't know where to direct you. They have absolutely no clue. And you have to remember that as a biological parent and as an adoptive parent and as an adoptee, we all have rights to confidentiality. Maybe somebody doesn't want to be found. And that's their right too. And I strongly believe that.
Well, I've probably talked to, I'd say, maybe 30 people. I mean, not one of them has been nice. I'll say, you know, my dad, he was 6'4", he had all white hair from birth, he's a doctor. Do you know someone that looks like that? And they're like, we have lots of members. Are you stupid? You know, how do you think we'll know him if you don't have a name? And I'm like, come on, how many 6'4" medical doctors do you have who've had all white hair since birth? And I mean, it's just like, you know, couldn't you help a little?
Well,
I was just going to say, this sounds like a very difficult way to make your search, and that there are many, many competent professional people who I'm sure would be of a great deal of assistance to you. And that's what I'd like to encourage you, because maybe you will find more of what you're looking for, rather than developing an anti-Semitic
I would just like to get us back to the issue of ethnicity and these topics. I said in the paper that these are very difficult topics to address because they do ripple off into so many related and then unrelated areas as you keep going further and further. But I hope some of you will address the issues of ethnicity. I know you've had your hand
Well, I
up
just
as
have a
well.
statement and then a question is that as a United adoptee, when I met my ethnicity, my birth ethnicity, Stephen, I found for me it was a place that I belonged that I hadn't figured out in my adoptive context. And belonged in a way which is so primal and so stupid to talk about that it's just, you know, I don't know how to say it except it was there. So I wondered if you had searched, or have you made any contact with your boyfriend?
Well, it's coming up in a year now. I've been
Looking after it.
trying, really. I mean, I want to. I mean, it really is a primal thing. I feel like I can't make any. I'm working my career and everything else, but I can't really make any major decisions about religion, about who I am, about anything about me until I find out. And maybe they'll be dead, and then I'll have to just invent myself or whatever. But when I found out that I was Spanish, Norwegian, and this and that, and I mean, which is kind of bizarre, you know. Oh, by the way, talk about ethnic looking. I lived in Europe for a while, and everyone thought I was American. They knew I was American. I didn't open my mouth. I looked like generic, cross hybrid. You know, I'm all over the map or something. You know, but it's like I think that will fill a void, which is, I mean, the full void that I have. You know, I mean, and I want to ask my birth mother, what do you think I should do? You know. Do you want me to be a Catholic? Do you want me to be a Jew? Do you want me to be nothing? Who are you? What did you want from me? And I don't know if I can do anything until I... Anyway, so...
Well, you'll
It's a
know.
big bird now.
What if she doesn't want to be
Give
filmed?
you two little bits of information, two resources, I should say. I first found out in 1968, I was 32 years old, that I was half Italian. My adopted mother leaned across the table and said to me, "You're half Italian, you know." And she went on eating. Which I don't know, she said. I said, "Well, what about my mother? What about my father?" She said, "Oh, the other one was 100% American." On eating. And then she said to me, "Well, I guess there's some good Italians." 8 years later, I decided to find out something about Italians. I come from back east. All I knew was the stereotype. I read a book called Blood of My Blood by Richard Gambino, which immediately validated and established for me my true ethnicity. I've had some experience with Judaism, with converts. There's a book called To Be a Jew by Rabbi, what's his name? Dunnan? D-O-N-I-N. Right. There's a chapter in there about adoption, and he does specifically state that a person may be said to have been a Jew if he had a formal circumcision, a religious circumcision of breast. But there are other things in there that might help you come to some kind of conclusion about who you are, but you won't really know for sure until you meet your birth families. Then you can
God willing.
you can pick this part from your birth family, this part from your adopted family. You put them all together and you know who you are. It worked for me.
I'd like to react to that, just one thought, because obviously I'm very supportive with the idea of finding your birth family, and as I said, it's been enriching, but I'm a little bit worried when I hear counsel like this being given to someone about something that may never happen, with the premise that somehow if he doesn't connect with his birth family, he's never going to be a whole person, or a person that feels good about himself. And I have to believe, Stephen, that while it may be wonderful and valuable, or it may be a very painful experience, we don't know when you connect with your birth family, should that happen, and I hope it does for you. I have to believe that there's ways you can get your life together where you feel comfortable and good about who you are as a person, as a man, and whatever religious conviction you choose to take. So, while I agree with you with the idea that he should continue to search, or anyone who wants to do so, and that there will be questions answered that will not be answered any other way. For me, it had to be as simple as medical history. You go to the doctor and you never have a clue. But the idea of being able to be a complete human being, that would worry me if it were dependent on finding some people that may or may not even be out there.
Can I ask you a question, like comment on a question? The comment is, just finding out, getting my NDO, whatever, non-identifying information, I was euphoric. I mean, that grounded me. I mean, it's already done something for me. So it's not like it's it's already given me something to hold on to, which I never had before. So it's almost like a fait accompli. It's just not full on, but it's already worked. And I have a question. It's kind of putting you on the spot, but okay. Someone said to me I was damned to I'm damned to hell because I don't believe in Jesus. And I was wondering. I said, well, I was born from a Catholic mother. I mean, why would God take me out of a Catholic where I was safe, presumably, not being damned to hell? Why would he take me out of this situation, put me into a Jewish family, and then make them, very aggressively controlling Jewish family, and then say, okay, now you're damned to hell unless you come back to the fold or something? I mean, maybe it's a test, but why is he putting me through that kind of a ringer?
Well, I think as the moderator, I do want to see if we can shift this slightly back to ethnicity, because I think we're getting into some areas that we're never going to be able to answer. There are many, many opinions, many experiences, many different points of view represented not only on the panel but in this room, and I can respect how difficult this topic is. Believe me, I have spent months and months reading and talking about it and thinking about it, and it is very exciting, but it is very, very difficult. So if we can come back to the issues of ethnicity, I'm curious from the people in this room, how many of you believe that there is an ethnic personality that we're born with, as opposed to, oh, wow, I don't know where to begin, but the lady in pink has had her hand up quite a while.
I just want to make one comment, Steve. Not all Christians believe that you're damned to hell if you don't believe something. So please, just, try not to take all of these beliefs that seriously. I mean, there's a whole range of views in Christianity and Judaism and all that. But just a comment about ethnicity and personality. I'm an adoptive mother, and Sharon, I spent hours talking to Sharon as an adoption counselor, but my little boy is from Peru, and we had a wonderful experience of getting to meet the birth mother. And to me, as an adoptive mother, was so wonderful because she's kind of short, kind of heavy, and kind of dark, and very earth mother kind of person. And my little boy is of course, he has the same little chunky build and the same sweet little personality. So it was very reassuring for me to meet her, to know, what he's like. So I just personally would feel a real loss if I had not met, the birth mother of my son. So, and we do keep in touch, by the way. She's just a wonderful person. So, I personally feel that knowing about your heritage is that was very reassuring to me, and I think it will reassure him when he gets older, because I intend to keep the contact so he can get to know me, when he gets older.
Sharon, had you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say two quickie things. One, that's certainly looking at the Minnesota twin studies, which I'm sure you threw into the pile with all your research this last year, with all the things he can't explain that have nothing to do with what we would call genetics, that just appears to have been transmitted, that feels ethnic. I mean, as you look at the material, I think for me that was it added some more confirmation of the issues. But on the flip side of it, when I look at all the open adoptions that are going on where families are picking each other, it just feels to me that it's that common ethnicity. It amazes me walking into a room with people, even those that are transracial, interestingly enough, and find the commonalities. There was something there that allowed people to relate and get comfortable and feel like extended family. And as they describe what it is that caused them to pick each other, it feels like what they're describing is ethnic heritage, not something other than that. And that, to me, also feels relevant here. That given their own choice, they seem to gravitate to similar ethnic basics. And that doesn't have anything to do with even education or economics. It's broader than that.
Thank you. Yes.
My husband is the adoptee, and he was raised Polish and German. When he decided to search his background information, he said he was 1.5 Irish and one half Polish, I'm sorry, one half Irish and one half Polish. When we found his birth mother, he is one half Irish and one half Spanish. Now, you know, he does like his sauerkraut, but he likes it with red pepper. And he puts pepper cheese on broccoli. So, you know, it does give credence to both. But however, we think of that as being very strange. So why not go back and say, well, what? You know, then the Spanish with the Pole is strange. Because, you know, he does like the food that he was raised with, but he prefers it with the Spanish, which is the deepest in him. His clothes are absolutely, absolutely ethnic. His Spanish. He likes a lot of pockets and buttons and snaps and everything, and his father, who was 100% Polish, wore the undershirt up to here and, you know, the tie to church, and my husband has to have the shirt wide open down to here. You know,
Oh boy, but they clashed.
Very Spanish, raised lily white.
Just out of curiosity, how old was he when he was placed for
When
adoption?
he was placed, he was 2 weeks old.
Okay.
And when he found out that he was Spanish, he was 41.
So he could hardly have had.
He was 40 when he found out he was Irish and had no German in him whatsoever. He was very happy that he didn't like the German family. He didn't, but see, the Spanish in him more than anything. He was a warm, touching person, and he was raised by a German mother who was not touching. He always thought that she didn't touch him because he was adopted. But he never noticed that the rest of her sisters didn't touch their family either. But he thought that she didn't touch him because he was adopted. It never bothered him that his sister wasn't touched by her either. However, his sister was 100% Polish, raised with a Polish father. So she took with him, and she was very close. I don't think it was girl, daughter, father. I think it was Pole and Pole. I really do.
Thank you. Yes, the lady in white.
I have this theory, my theory, is that we have a genetic bond that we can't always describe, and regardless of, if we even find out exactly what it is, and we may be lucky. I was raised in one culture. I found two very distinct cultures in my birth family. When I became very torn between the two. I have a full-blooded brother, and he grew up in a Mexican home, and I grew up in an Italian home. And when we met, we didn't know which one to be. He tried to be an Italian with a name like Jerry Smith. And even for a Mexican, that's weird. You know? He had to go out with the name of Jerry Smith, and he's Mexican. But you know, we were full-blooded, we still are, full-blooded brother and sister, but we would view each other differently. I would say my brother, the Mexican, because he grew up in the Mexican culture, and he had a sister who was Italian. And we were, you know, we're the same. We come from the same parents. And it caused a supreme confusion, just absolute confusion in our life. We didn't know which one to be. And this might help you, Stan. At some point, and it took a long time, we settled back into what we were comfortable with, meaning what we grew up with, because we were half and half. He settled back into his Mexican culture, and I settled back more or less into my Italian culture, but they both pull at me immensely. I can't go buy a taco stand, you know. Or, interesting enough, he hates Italian food. But the pull was so great, and since day one, I didn't even know I was adopted. In fact, I wasn't technically adopted until I was 18. And I was never told I was adopted, and I certainly wasn't told of my heritage. I found out when I found my birth mother's name, I kind of looked at it and went, oh, I mean, very ethnic. And that set up that whole sense of confusion. I didn't know where I belonged. I had to break the news to my mother-in-law, which is German. And I thought, how is she going to respond? Even my adopted family, how are they going to respond to my nationality? They're not used to me as this. They're used to me as this. They view me as this. And yes, I'm both. But the point I want to make is the confusion was gigantic. And they both pull at me. They're both equally as important. But I have settled into...
Well, it's like the peppers and the sauerkraut.
Spaghetti
it's like
and
herring and Norway and whatever.
Yeah, I kind of view it now as I've settled into who I am, and it's the combination of the two. Two similar cultures, but very different. Here, the Mexican family. I found 19 brothers and sisters, and they're all very ethnic. And I grew up more or less with an Italian influence, but I grew up the same as you. My maiden name, my adopted name was Cummings. That even was kind of weird. And it sets up that whole confusion. But I had this genetic bond that I always felt, always, my whole entire life. When I found out, even though I was confused, it became so comfortable. It was right. This is me now. This is what it really is.
I've been to Norway, and a long time ago, I was in Norway for quite a while, actually, and I loved it before I knew any of that.
Did you feel anything?
Yeah, I did. I did.
It's being in Mexico.
There are summer places.
I'm a birth mother, and my son is biracial. His father's black, and he was placed with a black family and not told that he was adopted. So he didn't know he was adopted till I found him when he was 19. And in those teenage years, he never felt like he belonged. And he reacted on a racial basis, in a sense, and he reacted to this idea that there's a monolithic black experience, that all blacks will feel the same and vote the same and all this stuff. So he had this theory already going that there is no monolithic black experience when I came into the picture. And it answered questions for him that he didn't know he had, because it took it out of, there are pressures. I was told this thing, that he should be raised by a black family, and I bought that, and yet that's not the whole answer. Society says he's black, they look at him and say he's black, and yet he isn't, he's biracial. He's got the same questions you two have on this confusion and the bipolar nature of what he's going through. But I know that the reunion did help him, at least helped him identify what the other pole was. He didn't know what the other half was. And he tended to react on a racial basis, where now I think he's learning to choose between the two, in which he's both. And there's no question. No matter what society tells him, no matter if society tells you you look Jewish, therefore you should be, society looks at him, tells him he's black, and he knows not, he's both. But it isn't easy.
No, I think those are some of the most poignant issues when you get into all these areas of ethnicity. And we certainly can choose, if we wish, to have a great deal of ethnic pride and identification with those aspects of our ethnic backgrounds that we choose out of many multi-backgrounds, because I would venture to guess that for most of us, if we go back and research our lineages, we're going to find various national groups and many influences that merge together to create who we are. As I said, the problem is, and we're seeing it in this day and age, they're talking about what's politically correct, and I'm sure you've seen in some of the newspaper articles, some of the magazine articles, what's going on the college campuses today in terms of what one can say, what one can teach, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and some of that comes in the guise of trying to be more courteous to people and to cut down on slurs and so on, but it's also going the other way in terms of boxing people in. And so I think that's a part of what makes this all very, very difficult. Yes.
My twin brother and I have ended up on two different sides of this ethnicity. He and I, twins, we were born and lived in Greece until we were almost school age. He was placed with a family in upstate New York. I went to a couple in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His adopted parents contacted mine when we were in our early teens. Before I found our biologic family, I felt more Greek than he did because in Milwaukee the Greek community is extremely small. I had no contacts with Greeks when I was growing up, so I figured whatever I am, that's what Greeks are. Then I met my biologic family in Greece, and I figured, known to you, I'm not a thing like them. So I decided, gee, I'm less Greek than I thought I was. However, my twin brother went through quite opposite reactions. He felt less Greek before we met our biologic family. After he met them, he decided that he liked being a male chauvinist pig like all the Greeks are. And he fit right in. So it started on opposite poles and just kind of jumped across and ended up on opposite poles. I am now what he was 15 years ago, and he became what I was 15 years ago.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think, from what I hear a lot of people say, I think experiences are so individual. It's really hard to lump ethnicity and religion into groups because religion is an intensely personal thing and spans, if you ask 100 people what their definition of something is, you're going to get 100 different answers. And I think that that's probably true with ethnicity too. And there's a typical example of twins who totally flipped on their outlooks. And I think it's really hard to draw conclusions. I think everybody's experience is very individual. My two children that are adopted both have heavy German lineage. What are Germans? What does that mean? Somebody tell me. Does it mean they're cold and aloof? I don't know. They're both blonde, fair, blue-eyed, don't look damn thing like me, but my oldest daughter at 24 years old would like to live in my lap. She has always been the cuddliest, huggiest. My mother used to look at her and say, isn't there just a little bit of Italian in her? But there's not. I mean, it's I don't know what, if somebody, my son is German and Scotch. What does that mean? Does that mean he's supposed to be cheap with his allowance? I don't know what those things mean. And I think that they're stereotypes, and I think that they're negative stereotypes.
Yes.
There's some things about ethnicity, like my daughter has very, very straight white blonde hair. And she's in the 95th percentile for height. I'm 5 feet tall, my husband's 5 feet 6. And she has blue eyes. That doesn't matter so much. When she was little, she used to draw self-portraits of herself with dark curly hair. There's things about adoption that you want to be like your parents. All kids want to be like their parents. They want to identify. And as Sharon said before, if you're not like your parents, the more things that we can find in common, sometimes things in common help bond you, make you feel connected. Well, she's not going to feel connected by the way she looks. And that's partially because she's Swedish. And it's, the way she turned out, and I can't change it, and I'm never going to get tall, and she's going to be tall, and I think she's going to be gorgeous. But so I think that ethnicity has that, too, is that you might look different. And that doesn't mean that it's unsurmountable or that she won't turn out to be terrific, but it is something that's a reality that she has to live with, and, and that we have to live with, too. And I think that's part of it. And sometimes it's also behaviors, and I'm not quite as clear on how those are connected to certain ethnic groups, because I don't, I know all kinds of people that are German and all kinds of people that are Jewish and all kinds, so I'm a little bit afraid to do that, but certainly the looks I see.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. One of the things I'm hearing, however, though, is the fact that it's open and it's talked about makes it more acceptable than when it's kept a secret or it's an unknown and it's the boogeyman hiding in the closet that's going to come out and get you. And I think if we can do anything, it's to keep it an open flow of communication and encourage adoptive parents and adoptive children and agencies to keep the flow going. For one child, it might be, dealing with religious issues. For another child, it might be being blind. And they may need to come back and say, hey, what do you know? And maybe we need to,
You have to be able to come with
you have to be able to offer that information as it's needed, not something that sits for 20 years and wait until some decree is offered. I think that's part of it. And I don't think that sticks to ethnicity. I think that can go across the board.
Thank you, though. That's important. Yes.
Joni, did you keep with your adopted children? Are they interested in pursuing?
Not
Did
at
you
this
give
time
up
in there. In
any-
fact, I just asked them over the last couple of weeks because they knew that I was going to be doing this. Both of my children, my adopted children, first of all, when they were little, they thought that I went to the same person and got another one. When they were little, they thought they had the same biological mother. They got a little confused. As of right now, at almost 21 and 24, they have expressed no desire to do a search. If they want to, they're over 18, that's their decision. That's their decision.
Yes.
I have a sort of mixed family too. My husband and I are Jewish, dark, and we have one biological daughter. We have a son who's from the Midwest, blonde, looks very goyish, and we have another guy who's mixed black, Mexican, and white, and looks very ethnic. And so everywhere we go, people just can't figure it out. And I guess the way we've tried to handle it is we don't emphasize how wonderful it is to be Jewish or how difficult it is to be black or how Midwest it is to be goyish. We just don't talk about it in terms of better, worse, judging good, whether it's hard, whether it's easy. It's just not an issue in our household. I mean, our kids are Jewish, we're not real Jewish. And I think the way our kids have internalized it is not to put a judgment on that it's bad to be different and it's good to be the same. And so when we go out and people look at us and waitresses in restaurants make comments, they'll say, gee, you have the same parents, or are these all your kids? My son is kind of very basic. Someone will walk away and they'll look and they'll say, gee, doesn't she know anything about adoption?
That's
really?
wonderful.
I think part of it is how you teach your kids to look at it.
Absolutely.
I think we have just basically not made it an issue at all in our family. And I think our kids, there's some things, but it's not a big deal.
That's good. We're just about out of time, and I would certainly like to reiterate in terms of the last couple of comments that were made, the importance, I feel, of openness, of sharing information, of making information available to people if they choose to use it, if they want it. I think each of us has a different road to travel, and we each have to choose how we want to travel that road, and there shouldn't be impediments to us if we need to reach back historically and learn whatever there is to be learned. We may not be able to get too far. My mother's mother came to this country as an orphan. We don't know much about her side of the family, and nobody has ever bothered to do very much genealogical research. If we did, perhaps there's information, but on the other hand, there may not be. The fact remains that I know her name, and if I chose to do that kind of a study, I could do it. I think each of us is entitled at least to that. Life is very complex, very complicated, and I think as our panelists were so kind in sharing with us, and as many of you in the audience shared with us, there are a lot of questions and a lot of unanswered questions out there, and I would just hope that we would all maintain a spirit of openness in terms of the beauty and the diversity of people. I think there's great beauty among all people, and there's much for all of us to learn if we're open to it. Thank you very, very much for coming.
This concludes this session.